Welcome back to Killer Stories. I'm your host, Bobby Holmes. If you follow me on social media, you saw my post about the very human-looking bone I found last week while paddleboarding. My first thought was a femur bone, but apparently it's a tibia. While I'm glad to report it is not human, part of me was hoping I could help solve a missing persons case. That would have made an epic episode. But it turns out it's the tibia bone of what local police think is an elk. So now it lives in our garage. My husband thinks I'm a weirdo for bringing it home, but there was no service where I found it, and I needed to be sure I didn't stumble across human remains. So before you tear into me in the comments, I do realize you should never disturb the area. But if I left it, I'm sure an animal would have dragged it away. You should have seen my friend's dog sniffing it up and down. Now it's just one of the many weird things I've collected for my son, Penn, to admire. I hope you all enjoyed the bonus episode with him last week. He's been dying to make a video with me. If you watched on YouTube versus just listening on the podcast, you can see the cuteness firsthand. He is totally obsessed with dinosaurs, prehistoric animals, and all the scary things I'm glad are extinct. Penn had a blast recording with me, and I appreciate all those that have watched and commented. It made his day. This week, I'm back with a true crime story. I'm covering an infamous case of a mass murder from 1971. Family Annihilator, John List. If it isn't obvious, a family annihilator is someone who kills their entire family. Think Chris Watts. Still can't bring myself to cover that one. Maybe someday. Before we jump into the nitty-gritty, let's get some background on John. He was born September 17th, 1925 in Bay City, Michigan, to his German-American parents, Alma and John Sr. John Jr. was their one and only child. Unlike most of the murderers I discuss, John Jr. lived a very normal childhood. He was never treated poorly. His upbringing was strongly focused around the Lutheran faith. John Sr. was the Sunday school teacher at the church they attended. Oftentimes, children will rebel when their parents are too strict, but not John. He was 100% on board with the Lutheran religion and followed in his father's footsteps of later becoming the Sunday school teacher. John joined the Army in 1943 and worked as a lab tech for a few years during World War II. After serving 3 years, he attended the University of Michigan, and he became a second lieutenant in the ROTC. He graduated with a bachelor's degree in business administration and continued on to get his master's in accounting. John so far sounds like a stand-up guy, a smart man of God who served our country in World War II. In November of 1950, he was called back into active duty during the Korean War. John was stationed at Fort Eustis in Virginia. While he was there, he met a widow named Helen. Her husband was killed in active duty. Helen and her young daughter, Brenda, were still living near the base. John and Helen began a romantic relationship and married the following year. The newlyweds and Helen's daughter moved to Northern California. Now that John had a degree in accounting, he was given the opportunity to work in the finance corps for the U.S. Army. He finished another tour in 1952. The family moved to Detroit, Michigan, where John landed an accounting job. After that, he became a supervisor of a paper factory in the town of Kalamazoo. That doesn't even sound like a real place. It makes me think I'm singing Skinnamarink-a-dinky-dink, Skinnamarink-a-doo. While the family was living in Kalamazoo, they had 2 more children, Patricia and what I keep seeing in my research as John Jr., but clearly he is John List III. And later, their youngest child, Frederick, was born. Helen's daughter, Brenda, reached the age of adulthood and moved out. That's when John uprooted his family again and moved to Rochester, New York to work for Xerox. In 1965, the Lists made their final move to New Jersey. John took a job as vice president of a bank. He bought a ginormous Victorian mansion in Westfield. Even though it was in New Jersey, Westfield was only 16 miles outside of Manhattan, New York City. It was way too big for his family. The mansion had 19 rooms. They didn't have enough furniture to fill the space, and many rooms remained empty. With so much space, John allowed his mother, Alma, to move into the attic. If you hadn't noticed, that was quite a few career changes for John. In 13 years' time, John had 5 new jobs and 5 new places to call home. He was described as a loner. He didn't have any friends. While he definitely knew his stuff when it came to accounting, his personality became difficult for employers to deal with. I think maybe Helen found him difficult to deal with as well. She began drinking heavily to cope. John was let go from his position at the bank and wasn't able to hold down a job after that. He didn't want Helen finding out that he was unemployed, so every morning he got dressed as if he was going to work. Then he would head down to the train station where he spent his day. He would read books, the newspaper, and take naps. He wasn't sleeping well at night. The stress of being in major financial trouble was eating at him. John later describes how he felt at this time. Quote, "I grew up with the idea that you should provide for your family, and to do that you had to be a success in the job that you had, or you're a failure. And that was not a good thing to be." Unquote. John just went on pretending to work while in reality he stopped paying all the bills, including the mortgage. Up until this point, he had been taking money from his mother's savings account to pay the mortgage without her knowledge. But the mansion was nearing foreclosure when John had an epiphany. If he killed his family, they would avoid the embarrassment of his failures and be together in heaven. Not only that, but since Helen started her heavy drinking, she was starting to stray from her faith. John wanted to ensure that she made it into heaven before she turned to the dark side. In the Lutheran faith, it's a sin to commit suicide. I think that's the case for most religions. And because that sin results in your death, you would wake up on the other side in hell, not heaven. John thought long and hard about his plan. He was going to kill his family and then ask God for forgiveness. Then, with Jesus back in his heart, once he died, he would be reunited with his family in heaven. There's so many things wrong with that. If God really is all-knowing, I think purposefully doing something as horrible as murdering your entire family with the plan to just later ask for forgiveness should get you a big red X stamped on your pass to heaven. You can't just go back and forth because you know it's as easy as asking for forgiveness. Quite the loophole that is. But he felt his plan was foolproof. His family would be in a better place and he would see them again one day. This reminds me a bit of the Strack family case I recently covered. The difference was that the parents in that story both committed suicide. So, double whammy. Not only did they essentially murder their children, but they also tacked on the sin of suicide. Although, I'm not sure that they were really coming from a religious standpoint. They were trying to escape the evil in this world. Back to John List. He made his decision. He was going to kill his family to save them the financial stress and embarrassment, sending them to paradise in the sky. He had a 9mm pistol and a .22 caliber pistol. He started going to the shooting range regularly to practice. November 9th, 1971 was the day. Just like any other morning, the children left for school and Helen was sitting in the kitchen sipping her morning coffee. John walked up behind her and shot her point blank in the back of her head, killing her instantly. John later stated that he killed them from behind so they never saw it coming. Then he went upstairs to the attic where his mother stayed. She was very overweight and rarely left her room. Helen had brought her breakfast upstairs and she was still eating when John approached her. He leaned in and gave her a kiss before placing a pistol above her left eye and pulling the trigger. He left Alma laying in the attic and went downstairs to attend to Helen's body. He didn't want the children to see that scene. He moved her to the empty ballroom and scrubbed the floor free from bloodstains. Then John makes himself a sandwich and sat down to eat lunch. Cool as a cucumber with 2 dead family members in the house. While Patricia, Frederick, and little John, that's what I'm going to call him, were at school, John had some loose ends to tie up. He went to the bank and cashed out his mother's savings. Then he stopped by the post office and asked them to stop delivering mail for the family at the mansion, as well as canceling future newspaper and milk deliveries. Then he spent some time on the phone, explaining to people that Helen's mother in North Carolina was not doing well and they were going to go spend some time with her. He informed the school that the kids wouldn't be attending for a while, setting things into place so suspicion isn't raised when they go missing. After school, 16-year-old Patricia and 13-year-old Frederick return home, totally unaware that they are walking into a death trap. John shot them both in the back of the head. I understand he said he did that so they didn't see it coming, but I doubt he shot them both simultaneously. One of those poor kids saw or heard their sibling being murdered by their father. He moved them into the ballroom with Helen. 15-year-old John, little John, didn't come home after school because he had a soccer game. John attended the game to watch little John play as if nothing happened. When they returned home, John attempted to shoot little John in the head, but the gun misfired. Little John tried to fight back. After he was shot, John said he jerked around almost like he was having a seizure. He pulled the trigger repeatedly, landing 10 shots. 10? Just take a second and pull out your pointer finger gun. Pretend to pull the trigger 10 times. Doesn't that seem like a bit much? Even if the gun did misfire, that's an unnecessary number of shots. The interesting thing I found in my research is that little John was notably his favorite child. Did that have something to do with how John acted? In an interview, John said, quote, "I don't know whether it was only because he was still jerking that I wanted to make sure he didn't suffer, or that it was some sort of way of relieving tension after having completed what I felt was my assignment for the day." Unquote. He dragged little John's body and laid him next to his mother and siblings. All were placed on top of sleeping bags in the ballroom. John's mother was, in his own words, way too heavy to move, so her body was left in the attic where she died. He played religious music while he meticulously cleaned the house, leaving no sign of the 5 murders he just committed. John sat at the table with a pen and paper and composed a letter to his pastor. He attempted to explain his actions. He wrote about his financial troubles and concerns of the family falling for temptations of evil and not making it into heaven. He wrote, quote, "At least I'm certain all have gone to heaven now. If things had gone on, who knows if that would be the case," end quote. John grabbed a pair of scissors and walked around the house cutting out his face from every single picture. He was about to skip town and didn't want police to have any idea of what he looked like. This was way before digital photos and social media. He was a loner and it was doubtful anyone else had a photograph of him. The next morning after the murders, he went into the ballroom with his family to pray. Then he drove to JFK Airport in New York City and left his car parked there. This was an attempt to throw off the police. He didn't actually fly anywhere. Instead, he hopped on a bus and left town. In the meantime, back at the mansion, the bodies of the List family were not discovered for nearly a month. John covered his tracks well, and everyone assumed that they were in North Carolina visiting Helen's sick mother. But neighbors definitely found it strange that all the lights were left on in the home, and one at a time, the bulbs started burning out. A concerned neighbor called the police. They gained access to the house through an unlocked basement window. Inside, they found the decomposing bodies of Helen, Patricia, little John, and Frederick in the ballroom, and Alma in the attic. Religious music is still playing through the intercom system. The only person missing from this scenario is John List. He becomes the prime suspect. But remember, there are no photos left behind. The only thing to go by is descriptions of John from his previous coworkers and neighbors. John had nearly a month head start. He could be anywhere. But he ended up in Denver, Colorado, and changed his name to Robert P. Clark, which was the name of a fellow classmate in college. He started working an under-the-radar job as a fry cook. But eventually, John, or Robert, slowly started mimicking his old life. He was hired as an accountant at H&R Block and joined the local Lutheran church. At this church, he met a widow named Dolores Clark. The two eventually married and moved from Denver to Richmond, Virginia in 1988. John was able to avoid detection for 18 years, living his new life with Dolores, who was totally oblivious to the fact that her hubby was a mass murderer. In May of 1989, John and Dolores were relaxing and watching evening television. America's Most Wanted comes on, and to John's surprise, he was the topic. Once again, there were no photographs to show, but a forensic artist carved an age-progressed clay bust. And it did actually look like John. He watched his wife closely, and either she was in complete denial or the situation went right over her head. She did not recognize the clay bust as the man sitting next to her. Luckily, someone else did recognize him. One of his neighbors back in Denver thought the bust closely resembled who they knew as Robert Clark and alerted authorities. They tracked him down in Virginia, and on June 1st, 1989, police showed up at the accounting firm where John worked and arrested him. He denied everything, attempting to keep the persona of Robert Clark. He insisted they had the wrong man. You can deny all you want, but evidence doesn't lie. John was in the military, which means he had fingerprints on file. Prints that matched this guy claiming to be Robert Clark, and prints found at the crime scene. Finally, John admitted his real identity to his defense team. They pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. While I agree what he did is insane, he was 100% aware of his actions. He knew it was wrong, or he wouldn't have gone into hiding. During his trial, John testified and explained why he did what he did. We already know he wanted to save them the embarrassment of financial failure and ensure their spot in heaven, yada yada. But he revealed new information about Helen. The reason they got married when they did is because Helen claimed to be pregnant. But she wasn't. Apparently, back in the day, most states required couples to have premarital blood tests. This blood test was screening for syphilis, an STD or STI, whatever they're calling it these days. It's a bacterial infection spread by sexual intercourse. Starting in the 1920s, syphilis infections were on the rise. It was treatable, but for some reason, people didn't seek proper treatment. Just continued the spread. If premarital blood test was positive for syphilis, you were not granted a marriage license until you were cleared from infection. As if no one was having premarital sex. Helen knew she had syphilis. She got it from her first husband, who was killed at war. She insisted that her and John be married in Maryland, one of the few states that did not require premarital blood tests. She didn't tell John or her doctors about her syphilis. This was very selfish because not only was she risking John becoming infected, but it can be passed to her babies. Her health continued to decline, and finally in 1969, she consulted a doctor. But by this point, her condition was no longer treatable. This contributed to her heavy alcohol consumption. In court, John said it, quote, transformed her from an attractive young woman to an unkempt and paranoid recluse, unquote. Helen would get drunk and talk about how she preferred sex with her first husband. And in public, I might add. This information isn't helping John's case. To me, this testimony is just adding to the motive for murder. John List was found guilty on 5 counts of first-degree murder and was to serve 5 life sentences in prison. He filed an appeal saying that the 5-page letter left for his pastor was a confidential letter and should not be used as a confession to the murders. Seriously? I can't even believe his attorneys went forward with that nonsense. It sounds ridiculous to say out loud. That letter you found in my house, the one where I explained why I killed my family, it was not addressed to you. Therefore, you cannot use it as evidence. The appeal was obviously denied. In 2002, John List did an interview with Connie Chung. He told her he did regret what he did, but he said he has asked for forgiveness and believes he will still go to heaven. March 21st, 2008, John List died from complications of pneumonia. He was 82 years old. I wonder if he's with his family or burning in hell. I hope it's the latter. I wanted to give a quick shout out to one of my listeners, Pia Thompson. She has been kind enough to support the show on Buy Me a Coffee twice now. I appreciate your kind words and expressing how much you love killer stories. If you want to show your support for the show, you can visit buymeacoffee.com/killerstories. If you click my link tree in the show notes, you will find it there as well as Killer Stories merchandise. Be sure to follow me on social media. I'm going to post the clay bust and photo of John List side by side for comparison. Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok at Killer Stories Podcast, and I'm on Twitter at Killer Stories PC. Send me your story suggestions to killerstoriespodcast@gmail.com. I haven't groveled for a review in a while. If you listen on Apple Podcasts, pretty please take a minute to rate and review my podcast. It helps so much with the exposure. I've got another episode of Killer British Murder Stories coming soon with my friend Stuart Blues, so stay tuned. Thanks so much for listening. Until next time, this has been a killer story.